Thank you. My name is Ava Anderson, and my team is here to talk to you today about the serious threat Russia, as a revisionist state, poses to the current international order and world security, as well as to lay out the next steps we must take to address this. The strategy my team will put forth can be summarized as a return to realism, and will be elaborated upon by Margaret Sutton, our economic affairs expert, Okan Kushuk, our regional relations expert, and Kevin Silverman, our military affairs expert. So we're here to push for handling Russia in a realistic manner, which means taking a strong stance economically, regionally, and militarily. And its invasion of Georgia in 2008 and its invasion of Ukraine in 2014, along with the annexation of Crimea and its subsequent support for pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine, Russia has failed to respect the sovereignty of its neighboring states. Some argue that Putin is lashing out due to weakness or acting in defense of ethnic Russian populations in these countries. Others argue that Putin can simply be dismissed as an irrational actor not worthy of confrontation. However, we know none of these to be the case. His actions have had extremely great strategic benefits, as is clear with the annexation of Crimea, as Crimea is of serious consequence in determining who has control of the Black Sea. So looking at the fact that Russia's aggressive actions have been so strategic in terms of regional control and influence, it is clear that Russia is acting as a resurgent and expansionist power which benefits from the weakening of European unity. In Putin's previous actions and future plans, the immediate threat is a regional one. However, if we fail to act now, it could lead to global consequences. At the recent 2016 Warsaw Summit, NATO described how Russia's aggressive actions, including provocative military activities in the periphery of NATO territory, and its demonstrated willingness to attain political goals by threat and the use of force, are a source of regional instability, fundamentally challenge the alliance, have damaged Euro-Atlantic security, and threaten our long-standing goal of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. Beyond this basic threat, Putin has also breached the values, principles, and commitments which underpin the NATO-Russia Council, a relationship which has been cultivated since 1997. Additionally, Putin is actively trying to sow discord and dissent within the EU in other ways as well. He has funded far-right parties in Europe, such as the National Front, as well as supported the UK Independence Party, which is linked to the recent Brexit from the EU. All of these maneuvers are part of a pragmatic, long-term strategy to undermine European unity and expand Russia's influence. So why does the US care? One, the EU is the United States' single biggest trade partner. A disunited EU would have devastating effects on the American economy. Two, it is in our vital interest to support our allies, for credibility's sake, but also in order to protect ourselves from facing more direct threats to our sovereignty. Three, and most broadly, it is in our vital interest to protect the liberal international order, as the US is deeply rooted in such a system. Such an order is severely threatened by a divided Europe. What we wish to emphasize here is that while we take the sovereignty of these countries to be extremely important, the main issue is not simply about Ukraine or Georgia, or defending borders. Rather, the major threat we aim to address is Putin's use of aggressive maneuvers to go after the backbone of world security. So now that I've outlined why Russia's actions pose such a serious threat, we can judge whether the US response up until now has been adequate. We can learn from our mistakes of the past as well as build on the most recent NATO resolutions. So the US has allowed this current situation to form as Russia has taken advantage of Western passivity and ambiguity. After the crisis in Georgia, the US was not nearly strong enough in its deterrence methods to keep Russian aggression from playing out in a similar way in the future. The US response also was not nearly realistic enough in its calculation of Putin, as we trusted him far too greatly when we believed in the power and the metaphor of the reset button, which was only to be followed up shortly after by the invasion of Ukraine. We must also learn from the missed opportunity to return Crimea to Ukraine. In both of these cases, NATO should have taken a stronger stand by applying more pressure to Russia and making it clear that we would not play games. We must recognize that the recent NATO resolutions are a step in the right direction in our efforts to deter Russia, but they are not nearly enough to keep Putin from moving forward in his expansionist plans. We must do more, and we must ensure that the worst will not come due to our unwillingness to act. So how do we plan to do this? We'll address this threat economically, regionally, as well as militarily. On the economic front, we'll sustain sanctions and invest in Eastern European energy security projects. Regionally, we will strengthen alliances and affirm credibility, and militarily, we will bolster our NATO presence in the Black and Baltic Seas. These plans are part of a return to realism in understanding the gravity of this regional threat and its global consequences, and looking at our past mistakes to understand the realistic outcomes if we do not act now. With that, I'll hand it over to Margaret to talk about economics.
Thank you, Ava. I'm now going to discuss the ways in which Russia continues to pose an economic threat to European unity, as well as the ways in which the US and our allies ought to respond. Russia's greatest source of leverage over Eastern and Central European politics has been and continues to be its wealth of natural resources. The Baltic states, along with Finland, Sweden, the Czech Republic, and Bulgaria, still depend on Russia for almost 100% of their gas imports. More broadly, a third of the EU's natural gas and oil demand is supplied by Russian companies. Gas dependence on Russia hurts Europe for many reasons. It leads to corruption, as the Kremlin buys political support of foreign leaders, so Russia can maintain a predominant market position in their countries. It also affords Putin leverage over countries' foreign policy. Take what happened in Ukraine. Russia used economic blackmail to prevent Ukraine from a trade agreement with the EU in 2014. When Russia annexed Crimea that same year, the US, alongside the EU and other countries, responded with sanctions targeting Russia's economy, particularly its financial, energy, and defense sectors. These sanctions worked to limit exports to Russia, as well as financing for its economic development projects. They also targeted a number of Russian and Ukrainian defense companies, major energy firms, banks, and individuals in Putin's inner circle. What was their goal? Punish Russia for its acts of aggression and pressure Putin to comply with the Minsk peace agreements for Ukraine. The sanctions, along with the global drop in oil prices, have been effective in weakening the Russian economy. They have led to massive capital flight from Russia, a virtual freeze on foreign investment, and a ruble at an all-time low against the US dollar. These sanctions must be sustained so long as Russia keeps its troops in Ukraine. Even if the economic toll does not drive Russia out, their net effect is still positive. We will have punished Russian aggression, weakened its economy, and contained its capacity to push forward. To lift sanctions would be like throwing away your umbrella in a thunderstorm because you're not getting wet. Russia, while struggling, continues to pose a threat not just to Ukraine, but to the greater stability of Europe. Here's why. First, Putin has yet to comply with the Minsk ceasefire agreements, as Russia continues to support troops in eastern Ukraine. Second, Russia has been secretly funding far right-wing parties across Europe, encouraging the EU and NATO's disunity and instability. It has financed populist groups such as Golden Dawn in Greece, the Neo-Nazi Party in Germany, the Northern League in Italy, and France's xenophobic Front National. In doing so, Russia is not only working to undermine European unity, but also to revoke the economic sanctions that the West imposed after the annexation of Crimea. And third, Russia continues to reinforce and strengthen European dependence on its natural gas. The Nord Stream pipeline transports Russian gas across the Baltic Sea directly to Germany, and now Russia wants to go farther with its Nord Stream 2 project. Both of these projects pose a serious risk for the energy security of Central and Eastern Europe, which remain dependent on a single source, Russia. They are geopolitical threats, able to be used as a source of Russian leverage in the Ukraine crisis. To summarize, the thunderstorm is far from over. Though the political influence of Russian energy in European politics is declining, Russia's leverage over Europe remains concerning. In order to confront this threat, the US should follow the EU's lead in extending sanctions until January of 2017. This will continue to weaken the Russian economy, upping the stakes for Putin's continued involvement in Ukraine. Sanctions are only the short-term solution, though. Regardless of their status, Russia will continue to have political leverage over its neighboring states so long as it controls the gas market. In order to provide for the long-term energy security of the countries of Eastern and Central Europe, it is integral that we help them reduce their excessive dependency on Russian gas. We ought to invest more heavily in their domestic energy projects and incorporation into European energy infrastructure. We propose in particular to help fund projects that are already underway. On July 15th of this year, the EU, in conjunction with its energy union, invested 263 million euros in key trans-European energy infrastructure projects to increase energy security and sustainability, particularly in the Baltic Sea region. 263 million euros is not enough to fully implement these projects, though. The US should invest in the EU's efforts to develop a truly connected, diversified European energy market, one that does not rely solely on Russian gas. Let's be clear. We have no intention or desire to devastate the Russian economy. We have no intention of completely severing trade between Russia and the EU. We are only being realistic. Putin understands strength just as he understands weakness. He has proven that he will continue to take advantage of the instability and dependency of Russia's neighboring states so long as the West lets him. Yes, Russia is going to come out of this weaker, particularly the longer it continues to support troops in the Ukraine. Yes, it will require heavy European and American investment for energy infrastructure to be effectively implemented, but both of these costs are worth it in the long run. We must continue to hold Russia responsible for its actions. By applying consistent economic penalties on the Kremlin, in addition to promoting the EU's goal for energy security, we believe Russia will pose a much lesser threat to European unity and the political sovereignty of Russia's neighboring states. On that note, let me turn it over to Okan, who will discuss the regional aspects of our proposal.
Thank you, Margaret. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 was a blow for the United States, as it destroyed all hopes for Russia being a strategic partner of the European Union and effectively ended the relatively stable and peaceful post-Cold War order in Eastern Europe. The ongoing Russian presence in eastern Ukraine and Crimea are symptoms of a large-scale problem, that is Russian expansionism. Putin's Russia poses a major threat to European unity and the liberal world order that the United States upholds. It endangers the security, stability, and prosperity of the region. In order to preserve the current world order and confront the aggressive policies of Russia, ensuring regional stability and unity should be our primary objective. A comprehensive and long-term regional plan is crucial for a future where the entire region is incorporated into the liberal world order and is safe from any revisionist forces. American policies towards Russia and Eastern Europe so far have been vague at best. It is time for the American leadership to realize the grave situation. Stop being so weak and feckless and step up to the plate. At this point, if we want peace, we have to prepare for war. Now, how does this danger manifest itself? Russia has been preying on its weaker neighbors through a strategy of divide and conquer. As Margaret mentioned, by tactics such as backing up and gaining support from right-wing populist parties, which are by definition anti-liberal and anti-European, Russia has been working to disunite and debilitate Europe. Weaker non-NATO states such as Georgia and Ukraine were the first victims, but they won't be the last if we don't take a hardline stance and confront Russia. So, here are the steps that we should take. First, we need to strengthen our alliances for a deterrent and unifying forward presence in Eastern Europe to stop the divide and conquer policies of Russia. Thus, we would be helping NATO to protect the security of allied populations and the integrity of allied territories. The recent NATO decisions and our overall determination and their ability to act by triggering an immediate response to any aggression. NATO and the US would not tolerate any attack on our allies and would rapidly reinforce them if they come under threat and counter all contingencies. We can look at the Baltic Entente as a historical example of what not to do. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia signed a Treaty of Understanding and Cooperation in 1934 to be safe from Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. But it disintegrated because of a lack of cooperation and unity, and Russia occupied and annexed all three of these countries in 1940. So we're not proposing an exclusively regional Baltic coalition that is bound to fall apart, but instead building up a tough multinational presence that would bring in the military and economic support of ideally all countries in the NATO and EU as a united Western force to safeguard the integrity of Eastern Europe and bring the Baltic states closer with the rest of Europe. Another important regional power is Belarus. Belarus has a very central position and holds the key to securing the unity and safety of the region. A country that is historically known to be friendly towards Russia, Belarus has grown frustrated with coercive Russian policies and has been showing more interest in aligning itself with the West in the hopes of increasing its independence from Russia-led alliances. We can't rely on the full support or integration of Belarus. That's true. However, we should promise Lukashenko economic and military backing and a guarantee of full and unconditional assistance if Belarus is threatened by Russia. In exchange, we would have their support in strengthening the Western presence in the region. In addition, we can offer lifting the sanctions to Belarus for its cooperation, and even allow it to become a part of NATO if Lukashenko agrees to leave the Russian-dominated Collective Security Treaty Organization. Similarly, Kazakhstan has been engaging in more military and economic deals with the Western world, and we can bring them closer to our sphere of influence and contain Russia in Central and Western Asia. After the annexation of Crimea, Putin claimed that he'll do whatever he finds necessary to protect the Russian ethnic minorities in the region. As Eva mentioned, we have no reason to believe that Putin actually cares about Russians abroad. But the important point is, we cannot let him play the saving Russians abroad card. Putin can use the slightest mistreatment of these populations to start a conflict and even invade Russian majority areas such as northern Kazakhstan. What we should do is to ensure the safety and welfare of the ethnic Russian minorities in the neighboring countries through working with their governments and also to make sure that they can't collaborate with Putin in his divisive actions. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the Black Sea. The Black Sea has immense importance for the region since it connects Western Asia to Eastern Europe and Caucasia to the Balkans, and a large portion of the region's resources are transported through the Black Sea. It is pivotal for American interests because it is a great medium of free trade and connection between American allies. History proves that if you want to control the Black Sea, you need to control Crimea first. Russia has been increasing its presence in the Black Sea, and we have to understand that Erdogan had a point when he said that Russia aims to turn the Black Sea into a Russian lake. Ukraine and Turkey have become official military partners 2 months ago. We can work with the Turkish-Ukrainian naval presence to expand NATO influence. We could thereby counterbalance Russia's baleful presence and keep the Black Sea safe for trade and defensive purposes. I would now like to turn it over to Kevin, who will map out our military strategy.
Thank you, Okan. So there are 3 key military engagements the U.S. can be involved in relative to the Russian threat. First are these frozen conflicts that have directly benefited the Russians in the Ukraine and Georgia. Realistically, these gains cannot be overturned militarily. There are limitations to what military action can do. The military infrastructure in Crimea is too well entrenched now and would require a disproportionately large force to expel the Russians when compared to containing Russian advancements in the Black Sea. Second is the military posturing going along in the Baltics, which the NATO summit in Warsaw directly addressed. And third is the official requests made by U.S. allies asking for NATO support along the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. So before solving this, we must realize who we're going up against. Russia is very adaptable militarily, using hybrid warfare and currently employing various aggressive naval initiatives to take advantage of opportunities allowed by a dovish and indecisive approach. However, The Russian military lags behind compared to the American one in conventional terms. Instead, it has used its relatively weaker power to bully regional countries. Russia has increased defense spending to modernize their army to improve that conventional body. However, this has proved unsustainable due to the failing Russian economy, particularly the low price of oil. This leads to the conclusion that Russia does not pose an immediate threat in conventional warfare. This is the wedge the US should use to defend its allies and interests. Russia does not want an open war. Instead, Russia depends on the relatively inexpensive hybrid warfare, composed of utilizing cyber warfare, the deployment of special forces, and supporting local actors to accomplish Russian political goals. The Ukrainian invasion proves how decisive this medium can be to achieving its objectives. We are not saying Russia is a direct military threat to Western Europe, but it is a threat to European stability and American interests and allies. In naval terms, Russia has taken an increasingly more aggressive approach in the Baltic and Black Seas. Putin recently sacked his entire Baltic command for not confronting US ships in the area. Since 2014, aggressive submarine activity has shaken allies in the region and heightened tensions. Not putting checks on this only emboldens Russian ambitions and adventurism. In the Black Sea, Russia has the strongest fleet of submarines and naval aviation in the region. Russian ships and planes have encroached on sovereign Romanian and Turkish water and airspace, leading to confrontation. So, OCON has established that the areas of most strategic interest rely on strengthening NATO. The recent NATO Warsaw Summit addressed these concerns but did not go far enough. Because it did not go far enough, Russia has kept building up its forces. The NATO troops stationed now cannot stop a Russian invasion. Four brigades were deployed to the Baltic region and 4 brigades were deployed to Romania and Bulgaria. The latter is lesser known, but just as important because it demonstrates a commitment to defending the Black Sea. Other non-US NATO countries have demonstrated commitment to expanding their own military forces against Russia. The US is not alone in this fight and does not have to carry the weight in terms of troops or even spending. Canada, Germany, France, Poland, and Great Britain have supplied the majority of troops and ships for the latest round of NATO exercises and missions. Fear of Russian aggression will help drive a 9% rise in military spending this year continent-wide. So now I'd like to go into our policy proposals. The US needs to promote a greater multinational military presence in both areas. The US should also support European military integration led by France and Germany, and support Britain's interest in increased activity within NATO. Russia's forward position in Crimea is particularly troublesome. Lethal aid to West Ukraine, with emphasis on anti-aircraft and anti-tank weaponry, will help deter a Crimea-style operation in areas near the Ukraine. NATO should create patrols in the Black Sea and help with Allied fleet modernization, particularly Turkey, since they are the only true rivals to Russia there. Romania and Turkey have both expressed a desire for this, and it deters Russian encroachment. Though some might argue that this provokes Russia, the multinational aspect of this and the direct infringement on sovereign waters by Russia provide cause for mutual defense. We are making sure the Black Sea does not turn into a Russian lake. In the Baltics, NATO should work towards bolstering the NATO states there with 3 more brigades and incentivizing Belarus in order to prevent the possibility of a quick and effective Russian invasion. In conclusion, Russian military adventurism in the Baltic and Black Sea's sovereign territory and waters must be stopped. When Russia opportunistically took Abkhazia in 2008 and Crimea in 2014, and NATO responded with a dovish and indecisive approach, Russia kept moving forward aggressively in the Black Sea. Now we must contain that threat and strengthen our position in the region via the creation of permanent NATO rotational patrols in the Black Sea. Military buildup in Kaliningrad and along the Baltic states require a major deterrent effort on behalf by NATO. Russia understands the language of force and has used it effectively. But now Europe and America must stand together in order to combat Russia's divide and conquer approach. Now Ava will give us some concluding thoughts.
Thank you, Kevin. So in our return to realism, our economic, regional, and military proposals address Putin as the actor that he is, not the actor we wish he was. He has proven to be untrustworthy, unreliable, and manipulative. We are not the only ones worried about Russia. In fact, back in February, the Pentagon placed the Kremlin at the top of our national security threats. And at the beginning of this month, at the Warsaw Summit, NATO's resolutions confirmed the seriousness of this threat. Today, the U.S. has two choices. It can assert its strength and commitment to its allies, or it could trust Russia and accommodate its interests. To do the latter would be naive. It would enable Russia yet again to exploit visible weaknesses, invading and asserting power where there are no repercussions. Now it's time to stand firm and show visible strength. Today, perhaps more than ever, as the refugee crisis, climate disaster, and terrorism pose global threats, it is necessary for Europe to stand united. This is not just about Ukraine, this is not just about Georgia, this is about preventing Russia from continuing its effort to divide and rule Europe. The invasion of Ukraine is just a part of Russia's attacks on European unity. We must do what we can to take a stance and signify that these actions will not be tolerated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now open the floor for questions.
Great, I'll start. Thank you very much to all four of you. It's a very interesting, informative presentation. I have a question for Margaret on the economic recommendations. So you put forward a few very interesting short-term and long-term recommendations. Short-term, extending sanctions through January 2017. Long-term, kind of build the energy independence of European countries. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate more on the medium term, past this early 2017 point, if we don't see any of these very worrying trends that you've mentioned start to reverse. And it seems like your overall opinion is that they don't show signs of reversing. So what economic tools does the U.S. have at its disposal in that medium term to affect Russia's behavior? And I would ask you to consider or keep in mind the fact that this coming fall is September 2017, and then in 2018, Russia has both parliamentary elections and presidential elections that would weigh heavily on the Kremlin's behavior.
Thank you. So I would first say that the medium-term solution very much plays into the short-term solution, and that sanctions are effectively weakening the Russian economy, and therefore, before we work on these long-term investments, if we sustain these sanctions, that is going to continue to do what we want to be doing. And it's not, Russia doesn't pose an immediate economic threat right now, and so long as we continue to put pressure on Putin, we don't know exactly, it's hard to say how much the sanctions are working. We know, we can look at their effect on the Russian economy. We can't necessarily get in Putin's mind and say, for all we know, tomorrow Putin could be deciding to take troops out of Ukraine. They could be putting that much pressure on him. So I think the way we see it is, yes, in the short, medium term, we should be just sustaining these sanctions. They do not cost the U.S. that much to sustain. We do not rely that much on Russia as a trade partner, unlike the EU. And in the long term, we can work to gradually invest more and more in these long-term energy projects.
Thanks.
Excellent. So my question comes off of a quote you guys had where you said, the U.S. should offer full and unconditional support for Belarus. So the question I have is, Belarus is never going to be confused for a liberal democracy or a NATO ally. You look in Turkey today, they're having an increasing creep towards authoritarianism, not just in the aftermath of the coup, but previously, increasing ties to Russia, etc. So I think you guys did a really nice job articulately explaining why we should have a more aggressive policy than what we're going to hear from Russia TMA over here. But you still have to have limits on what you're trying to go for. Who is going to be given NATO membership, what countries is the United States willing to defend vis-a-vis the Russians? I didn't hear as much about that, and I think that that's just as important for convincing policymakers of the general public that, yes, we should be more aggressive, but here are the standards we're going to have. It seems like it's kind of a mix of defending the liberal world order, but also balancing Russia, but also some other stuff. So could you give us a sense of what the limits are for your policy beyond just kind of more aggression, more sanctions, etc.?
Thank you for your question. So we wouldn't want to be allies with Belarus at this point, considering that Lukashenko is probably the last dictator in those Eastern European countries, probably. But our deal would be more of a defensive and an emergency deal, so that if they come under threat by Russia, we would be helping them, and they would be helping us, increasing our presence in Eastern Europe. But of course, we wouldn't be forcing any kind of regime change. So it would be solely about their foreign policy and an emergency situation, and not about Belarus becoming more democratic.
So, a couple things. First of all, with regard to realism and really this concept of deterrence, and I'm interested in your analysis and recommendation on a couple of specifics here. First of all, is a cyber attack one that we can point to from Russia against a Baltic nation or any other nation? Will that be legally characterized as a violation of Article 5? That's the first question. The second is, how, in your analysis, how do you treat the time-distance challenge that we have, particularly with Kaliningrad? If Russia wanted to open up a land bridge to Kaliningrad, how do we deter that? How do we deal with the time-distance, which really favors the internal lines of communications from Russia than it does from us? And to the extent that it undermines deterrence when it's widely known throughout the world that we have this issue. And so that's the first set of questions on it. And then the second is with regard to us. We are, if there's no change in law, and candidly I'm trying to change it right now, but if there's no change in law, we are, in 2 years' time, we're going to go from a land force, the entire Army and the Marine Corps. We are now at the levels we are on the 10th of September of 2001. That's where we are today. If we do nothing, if we do not change law, we're going to go down to pre-World War II levels. We're going to hand out 70,000 pink slips to our servicemen and women. And how is that going to undermine deterrence when we're asking other nations? Your recommendation called for 3 brigades, multinational brigades, to move towards the Baltics. Are we undermining our own position by asking others to do more while we're drawing back to levels that are unprecedented since the Second World War?
So thank you for your question, Congressman. I'll start off by answering the second question about time distance. So the reason that we want the brigades placed already there is it's based off sort of this analysis made by the Rand Institute and War Games, and they said that placing the 7 brigades there and having them there already kind of negates the time distance issue. And any attack coming from Russia wouldn't primarily attack the top 2 Baltic countries, and it wouldn't be effective. And though there would be some attack in Kaliningrad, it wouldn't be able to overrun, and then we would be able to reinforce the troops there. As for your third question, that does become an issue, but it becomes less so because allies are starting to realize that if America can't carry all of the weight this time, then they're already showing that they're willing to step up to the plate. I mean, Poland, which would be gravely affected by this, is starting to take measures to make sure that 2.5% of its GDP is going to military spending. So though sort of if there is some lack of American power in sort of those negotiations, our allies are showing that they really have our backs and will be able to work towards deterring Russia. May you repeat your first question? I'm sorry.
Cyber. Is a state-sponsored cyber attack against the Baltics, will that invoke Article 5?
Well, I mean, sort of to answer your question carefully, because hybrid warfare still really hasn't been legalized and sort of codified yet. A cyber attack that would paralyze a nation a lot stronger than what happened in 2007 in Estonia or 2008 in Georgia could have crippling effects for a nation and would require some sort of response on behalf of NATO. Now, that does not mean invading Russia or starting an all-out war. What that means is perhaps reassessing the defensive structures that Estonia has, so it doesn't have, or that I'm using Estonia because that was where Russia had a cyber attack in 2007.
Just to quickly follow up, do you think it strengthens or weakens deterrence to leave it ambiguous? In other words, you're acknowledging it's an ambiguous situation right now, which I concur with. Do you think it's better to leave it ambiguous, or do you think it's better to try to lay down protocols and make it clear?
It strengthens deterrence because in the end it's a rational choice. We're showing that we're the rational actors and that if an action is taken by Russia, that we're not going to overstep our boundaries and become the aggressor, where we're sort of maintaining the liberal world order.
Okay, just one question, and I'm not sure it's a question, it's for Håkon. Wanted to hear more from you about the regional dynamics. I didn't hear much about proliferation or Middle East repercussions to your proposed policies. And maybe if you could tell us about what Russia's best move to your policies would be and how you guys have a plan with branches to address what his best move, given what you're advocating.
So for Russia, I think we can assume the worst case scenario and Putin putting forward a much more aggressive stance than he does now. And as for the Middle East, I think we can rely on Turkey to go along with our orders for the Middle East and keep in mind our interests in the region. And for now, even if everything falls apart, I think Russia would continue to support Assad in Syria and go along with their with their plan.
What's your reasoning behind why Turkey would follow America's interest in this case?
As for, well, at least I think Turkey is the most reliable NATO ally in the region, and although the increasing authoritarianism and the danger with the coup is a problem that might endanger our relations with Turkey in the future, we, in terms of the policy against Assad and in terms of supporting the insurgencies against Assad, I think Turkey and the U.S. have similar interests, and we can assume that it's going to go on for some time. And if Russia continues to support Assad, and also Iran continues to support insurgencies that are supporting Assad, we can just go along with the same, and we can have the same interests, and we can go along with with what we have so far. So I think, in fact, our ideas and our more realist stance can apply to the Middle East, and we could have, although it's outside of our scope, I think we could have pretty similar interests in mind, and we could have a similar attitude toward Russia, and in fact Iran too, in the Middle East.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Russia Team B. Russia Team A.